Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Arts, Parks, and Los Angeles River Committee, Los Angeles City Council. This is our regularly scheduled hearing, and we will officially begin this committee hearing. What I'd like to do first, fellas, first of all, welcome Bob Blumenfield and David Rue. We will be joined at around 11:30 by Curran Price, who has a prior commitment, but he will be joining us. We are at quorum, and what I'd like to do is begin with public comment and comment on the items. And if you are here to give comment on any of the items, please fill out speaker cards, because we'll be closing comment cards at some point fairly soon. So having said that, let's start with general public comment, 1 minute, and we have Wayne Spindler providing general public comment.
All right. So today we have a puppet that's going to tell you about the parks. But of course, again, you guys are trying to buy these toxic properties in the name of some kind of river. Just keep in mind that when they say remediation, it's not remediation for parks, it's remediation for commercial development. Buying this stuff is a bad thing, or especially at the housing market and the property values are through the roof right now. You could wait later, get this stuff for a big discount, because what you see on that screen is just like what you see here. It's a puppet game. It's an illusion. You're never going to get that river to look like that. It's too much runoff and waste. The people running this city cannot make that river look like that. It'd be nice if it was, but it's never going to happen. Save the money and fix the sidewalks instead.
Okay, Mr. Spindler, you also have comment cards on all three items. You have 1 minute for comments on items 1, 2, and 3.
For all three?
All three.
What a bunch of bullshit.
Well, go ahead.
Well, I'm just a puppet, and I only have a minute to talk. 1 minute for 3 items. Is that fair to all of you? It's not fair to me. So, all right. Item 1, financing district study. It's just a bunch of bullshit. Vote no. Item 2, fee programs. You want to charge kids to use your river? Don't charge anybody to use the parks or the rivers. It's free. It's free for animals, and it should be free for human beings. Why do people have to pay, but I can run in any park I want to? So anyway, to this committee chairman, fuck you.
You can have 1 more minute to expand on all of your wisdom that we're hearing.
Oh, good.
But please stick to the items.
Oh, perfectly.
Items 1, 2, and 3.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay. Well, on item number 3, as you know, the G2 Taylor yard is contaminated with all kinds of toxic waste. Yes, you can just smell the toxicity, but you're trying to buy a toxic piece of real estate, and you're going to have to remediate it for millions and millions of dollars more, and you don't know how much, because me and my friends attended the last meeting, and it was upwards of $34.5 million just an additional cleanup. But of course, there's a Delaware corporation. They give campaign donations to you. Of course, not to David Rue, because he's very, very straight. So please, to Bob Blumenfield and David Rue, vote no on item 3 and save us taxpayers from so much harm. Thank you.
Mr. Sutton-Willis, that brings us to item number 1.
Item number 1, Economic and Workforce Development Department report relative to the Los Angeles River Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District Study. We have staff from EWDD and consultants available.
Thank you so much. We are joined by Samuel Hughes and representatives from HR&A advisors who generated the report along with the city. Please begin your presentation. I understand that we have about 30 minutes because you have another obligation, so please.
Thank you, Councilmember. Good afternoon, committee. Sam Hughes with Economic and Workforce Development, and certainly joined by Paul Silvern with HR&A Advisors. In discussing enhanced infrastructure finance districts, it's necessary to understand that it's an economic tool created in 2015 that essentially allows cities and counties to finance specified types of projects with tax increment contributed by eligible consenting taxing entities. And while an establishment and investment policy outlines the procedures and policies of forming an EIFD, the report before you today is a study of an LA River EIFD that specifically outlines a revenue yield analysis and funding capacity of one or more EIFDs along the LA River. And while I mentioned the establishment policy, I think it's worth noting that the department is looking to have that particular draft policy to the Economic Development Committee within the coming weeks. But in the interim, we have the study that HR&A has provided on behalf of Economic and Workforce Development, and with that, I'll turn it over to Paul Silvern.
Thank you, Sam. Good morning, council members, city staff, and members of the public. I'm Paul Silvern, a partner with HR&A Advisors here in Los Angeles, and with me this morning are the other partner in our office, Amitabh Barthakar, who co-directed the project with me, Judith, who helped to manage the project, and Thomas, who worked on a lot of the technical analysis and is doing the old school slide projection over there for us. As I think all parties now agree, the Los Angeles River is has the potential for becoming a very dynamic and recreational and cultural asset in the city of Los Angeles. It winds through 32 miles within the city of Los Angeles and then continues down towards the port of Long Beach. And because of its enormous potential, the City of LA and others have been working on a number of different planning initiatives to try to recognize that potential in Los Angeles, particularly including the Los Angeles River Revitalization Master Plan and the work that the mayor and city did to encourage the Corps of Engineers to pursue Alternative 20 for the 11-mile stretch of the river north of downtown, which has particular opportunity for revitalization and naturalization of the concrete channel. All of those initiatives have also identified about $6 billion worth of capital improvements that would be required to fulfill the ambitions for the river. That's an updated estimate that we have prepared based on the original list of projects in the LA River Master Plan and the current estimate of the city's share of the cost for Alternative 20. How to fund that ambition is a serious and open question. And I think the council and mayor were interested in understanding the degree to which a new financing technique that was adopted by the governor and the state legislature a couple of years ago could help to fund at least some of that ambition. So what we want to do today is provide just a quick overview of this new technique called Enhanced Infrastructure Financing Districts, or EIFDs for short, and present to you our estimate of the revenue yield that we believe could be generated by that technique, whether to actually pursue formation of the district and potentially to seek voter approval to issue bonds pursuant to the enabling statute are all decisions for the mayor and council to make at a subsequent date. Our job in this effort was to estimate what we think the revenue yield from this technique might be so that you could make an informed judgment about whether and if so how to proceed. EIFDs bear some resemblance to the redevelopment-based tax increment financing structure, but there are some important differences. As you will recall, the key financing technique that redevelopment agencies used to use before they were dismantled by the governor and legislature in 2012 was tax increment financing, in which the relative increase over a base year in property tax revenue is walled off and bonded against in order to generate money for capital improvements. This is the first new opportunity to use tax increment financing since the death of redevelopment, but it works in pretty much the same way. But there are a couple of key differences. While it is still a place-based technique, it does not require any findings of blight the way redevelopment project areas used to. It does not give the city, in this case, automatic rights to the property tax revenue of the other taxing entities outside of its own jurisdiction. That now has to be negotiated case by case. And in all cases, K-14 school districts, property tax revenue cannot be used as part of the financing setup. On the other hand, there are some new flexibilities that this technique provides, particularly the ability to issue bonds for as long as 45 years, though we think 30 years is probably the most reasonable time period to look at given market circumstances, and the voter threshold to issue bonds, not to form the district, which the council or others can do on their own, but to issue bonds requires a vote, and there's now a 55% threshold to do so, as opposed to a two-thirds majority. As I said, the basic concept is that EIFDs capture the incremental increase in property tax within a defined district, but of course that is all subject to the continuing requirements under Prop 13 that assessed valuation can only grow at a maximum of 2% per year. So in analyzing the potential for an EIFD around the river, it becomes particularly important to look at how much vacant land is subject to new development and the incremental growth in or change in property values over time. It's also important to note that as with tax increment under the old redevelopment days, these are not new funds to the city. This essentially involves a redirection of property tax revenue that would otherwise go to the general fund, which is an issue that came up, as you might guess, in our discussion with the CLA and CAO's office and led to some of the assumptions that we used in modeling the revenue yield. The approach we used in making our estimate went through about 5 separate steps. We worked very closely with a city team that was made up of the Mayor's Riverworks team, the CAO, the CLA, the Bureau of Engineering, the Planning Department, and of course the Economic and Workforce Development Department, which commissioned the analysis in the first place. And we did a fair amount of work to assemble a wide range of parcel-specific data around the LA River, initially within about a 2-mile radius around the river, just to make sure that we had all of the available information to work with. But as we'll see, we focused our analysis primarily on a 1-mile radius, that is 1 mile from the center line of the river on to the north and south on either side of it. We then created a very detailed financial projection model that took into account all of the potential changes to individual parcels, and I'll talk a little bit about some of those assumptions. We then previewed our preliminary results and discussed them with some outside stakeholders, including representatives. I believe some of them may be represented in the room today from Friends of the LA River, River LA, the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy, the Trust for Public Land, and representatives from the Army Corps, among others, to get feedback on our initial estimates and approach. And then we refined the analysis based on the information that we got. In terms of the methodology we used, we basically moved through 3 basic steps. The first was what I'm calling a geospatial analysis, which, as I said, involved collecting a very rich data set about every parcel immediately proximate to the river, and its characteristics and assessed valuation. I should note that in making the estimates, which we believe are conservative, we took out of the estimates all of the land that fell within redevelopment project areas that are still on the books and still have recognized obligations to pay off. We took out all of the lands that are in public open space, owned by public agencies, and other protected lands, even though some of them might in the future be redeveloped, but we assume for purposes of this analysis that none of them would be. We assumed only existing zoning. We made no heroic assumptions about redevelopment of parcels or that zone changes or general plan amendments or community plan amendments of any kind would occur in the future. We took only the existing zoning into account, and we focused primarily on vacant parcels, which were defined as those that were actually completely empty or those with only about 10% of their assessed value with improvements, meaning that there might be a garage or a small structure on it, and it was primarily vacant. But our focus is mostly on vacant land and the turnover of existing properties, and for those vacant lands, how they might be redeveloped under existing zoning and only to the extent that they could accommodate the growth projections of the Southern California Association of Governments for this area of the city. We then looked very closely at a series of modeling assumptions that needed to be made about real estate values, turnover, price appreciation, and so forth, so that we could feed that into the model. And then we measured the incremental difference in assessed value over a 30-year period compared to the existing baseline, and then estimated using assumptions that we coordinated with the CAO's office on debt issuance about what a 30-year bond against that incremental value would yield. Now, in terms of the geographies we looked at, as I said, we focused primarily on a 1 mile radius, meaning 1 mile on either side of the center line of the river. But we also looked at the analysis in terms of 13 sub-districts around the river, because it remains to be seen, of course, whether the city might be interested in pursuing a single EIFD or more than one EIFD. And it was important for us to help inform your judgments about that, to look at this in a series of geographies, and we have individual estimates for all of these. So in collaboration with the city team we worked with, we divided the length of the 31-mile length of the river within the city of LA into these 13 subregions, which generally align with community plan area boundaries, but in some cases freeways and a couple of other geographies that led to logical divisions. And then we used these 13 sub-areas in order to make our revenue yield estimates. The net result of what we estimated is shown in this chart, assuming first that 100% of the city's property tax revenue generated within this 1 mile radius would be devoted to this purpose. The city currently collects on average about 26 cents of every dollar of property tax for properties located within the city. The county on those same properties receives almost another 25 cents out of every dollar, and the county flood control district derives a small share as well. So initially what we did is we looked at only the revenue yield over 30 years within the 13 sub-areas located within the city of LA that I showed on the previous slide, and then separately for the revenue yield that would come from the county share of the property tax and the flood control district. Now, in our conversations with the CAO and CLA's office, and because of this issue I mentioned before about this not being new money to the city, but essentially a redirection of existing property tax, we adjusted our assumption to only count 75% of the property tax yield from this area, on the assumption that the city would want to keep the other 25% to fund all the other general fund purposes for which property taxes currently pay. I should also add that on this chart and the previous chart, we have not yet, but I will in a moment, show you the implications of adding small areas of the city of Glendale and Burbank and the unincorporated area around Universal City to the mix. So this only reflects the revenue yield derived from properties strictly within the city of Los Angeles. And what we're showing in this chart is if we back down the share of city and county and flood control incremental property tax revenue to 75% and bond against it over 30 years, that this could yield approximately $1.9 million. And then if we just counted on an incremental year-by-year basis, it would total about $53 million over the first 5 years, or $112 million over the first 10 years. Bear in mind that while the state enabling legislation allows for bonding against this revenue, the city need not do that. It could, instead of bonding, just use the incremental property tax growth on what we refer to as a pay-as-you-go basis and fund capital improvements that way as well. But the biggest bang for the buck clearly for the city clearly comes from bonding against that revenue stream. If we now add in the relatively small incremental area of the cities of Burbank, Glendale, and Vernon, which fall within the 1 mile radius around the river, as well as the unincorporated area around Universal, into the mix. And again, assuming that only 75% of the eligible property tax revenue from the city, county, and county flood control district are used, we estimate the revenue yield would be about $2.3 billion, as shown in this chart. The analysis that we produced is very sensitive to a series of assumptions that we made. Again, we believe these are all conservative and reasonable, but the estimates could be potentially higher if certain of these certain variables were to change. Among those sensitive variables, all of which we have tested independently and in various combinations, include, of course, the boundaries, the area that is covered by the district, the taxing entities that are involved. So far, we've only counted the city, the county, and the county flood control district, but there are probably 15 or 20 others that get small shares of the property tax besides K-14 schools that could be included. The real property value growth assumption is another sensitive variable, as well as property turnover rates and new development values. We found from our work that less sensitive values included the pace of development, because so much of this area is already built out. There's not that much vacant land, except in a couple of isolated areas. So that did not turn out to be a very sensitive variable, nor did proximity to the river if we were to ascribe a value premium to being closer to the river rather than further away. This chart just simply shows that rather than bonding against the revenue, if you were to not do that, but just simply spend property tax revenue as it was generated within this district. Again, this is the incremental increase over existing property taxes. It shows you the year-by-year pattern of how those would grow. The red line at the top includes not just the city of Los Angeles, but the small shares of the other adjacent cities. And then the blue line represents what the year-by-year revenue yield would be for the city and county without the adjacent cities. The last step in our analysis after we generated these estimates, which, as I said, we reviewed with a number of outside stakeholder groups and carefully with the CAO and CLA's office to get their feedback on it, was to compare the revenue yield with the actual estimated cost of all the improvements that were anticipated by the 2007 LA River Revitalization Master Plan, plus the current estimate of the city's share to implement Alternative 20. We looked at it for the river as a whole, and based on some feedback we got from some of our stakeholders, we looked at it in terms of 2 sub-areas rather than 13, that is north and south, essentially, of Griffith Park. And the results of that analysis are shown in this slide. So beginning in the upper left, where we're showing the $1.895 billion, which is the estimated revenue yield from 75% of the city's, county, general fund, and county flood control districts' property tax shares, we then deducted first a set-aside of 20% of that for affordable housing. As I'm sure council members have heard repeatedly in all the discussions about the LA River, there are lots of concerns in the communities that border the river about gentrification and involuntary displacement, and that while the Eifd statute itself does not require any set-aside for affordable housing in the way redevelopment used to, it does require replacement of any affordable housing, but it doesn't require a set-aside for new affordable housing. But many of the stakeholders we talked to and listening to commentary from the community persuaded us to include a 20% set-aside for affordable housing. So we added that as one additional infrastructure cost, and it is an eligible expenditure from Eifd revenues under the statute. We then took out the estimated $980 million city share of the Alternative 20, leaving a residual of about $535 million after these revenues are bonded against over 30 years, which represents, unfortunately, only about 10% of the roughly $5 billion of capital improvements that are listed in the LA River Revitalization Master Plan. But it's important to emphasize, of course, that this revenue stream would cover the city's cost of Alternative 20 and still make an important contribution towards all of the residual capital improvements. If we look at this in terms of north and south of Griffith Park, north of Griffith Park, which includes portions of Councilmember Blumenfield's district, this is a situation in which the revenue from that part of the river would more than pay for the cost of the specific capital improvements in that part of the river. But of course, the Alternative 20 is not physically located north of Griffith Park. It's south of Griffith Park. And so there would be essentially a net contribution towards the overall river looking to the north. Looking only at the southern portion south of Griffith Park, however, which doesn't have as much of a revenue yield, and that, of course, is where Alternative 20 would be situated. That would generate basically a deficit compared to the affordable housing cost and Alternative 20. And so it is very likely that the city would need to look at capturing revenue from an EIFD around the entire river in order to mix revenue generation and costs for the benefit of all citizens in the city and the surrounding region. So in overall conclusion, I think we can say based on these estimates that the roughly $1.9 billion that we've estimated clearly is an important source of revenue to pay for all of the public improvements anticipated around the river at the moment, though it would only fund, a share of those, but an important share. It's also, from our analysis, absolutely critical that the city work collaboratively with its colleagues on the Board of Supervisors to attract the county's participation in this, because as we've seen in many other instances in which this new financing technique is being tested around the state, and by the way, to our knowledge, there are no EIFDs in place yet, though many are being studied, that cities alone, because of their relatively small share of the property tax dollar, typically can't generate enough revenue to make this work. And so county participation will be very, very important. And we would encourage you to continue your ongoing discussions with your colleagues on the Board of Supervisors about this opportunity. An EIFD financing plan, which would be a subsequent step in this process should the mayor and city council decide to pursue it, will need to include other funding resources clearly. The EIFD will make an important contribution, but by itself it's not enough to fund clearly all of these capital improvements. And then in terms of actual next steps, while our analysis really didn't involve the procedural requirements to move beyond these estimates and actually setting up the district, we believe that it would be very important in moving forward if the council and mayor are interested in pursuing this opportunity to identify champions within the city who can begin to carry this measure forward and lead the discussions with your colleagues on the Board of Supervisors, to work at communicating clearly the potential economic and social value of this revitalization effort, and develop an overall compelling story about doing so, and begin to also perhaps open up discussions with your colleagues to the south, all the way down to the city of Long Beach. And many of those communities are actively involved in looking at revitalization strategies as well. Finally, the procedural steps under the state enabling statute, should you be interested in pursuing them, would be to finalize the EIFD strategy and build the political and community support to do so. Obviously negotiate with your colleagues on the Board of Supervisors about county participation, actually form the EIFD itself, which is something that the council and other participating jurisdictions can do on their own initiative, refine the yield estimates and identify other funding sources, develop and approve an infrastructure financing plan, and establish the public financing authority, which would actually guide this work. That would be a separate legal entity outside of the city itself. And then I believe our estimates make it pretty clear that seeking voter approval for issuing bonds against the property tax, incremental property tax revenue would produce the greatest amount of revenue for the city. So that concludes my report, council members, and my colleagues and I would be glad to answer any questions you have about it. There is, I should note, as mentioned in Jan Perry's staff report for today, a report that we prepared, which is available for your review and the public's review.
Terrific. Thank you, Mr. Silver. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Mr. Hughes, would you like to add anything at this point to the report?
No. I
Okay.
think it's been covered. Thank you.
Terrific. So colleagues, I know that HRNA, they have a little less than 10 minutes to be here. And so my questions aren't actually for HRNA. I have questions and would like to dialogue with you, Mr. Hughes. So what I'll do in just a moment is turn it over for questions specifically for HRNA. But just one thing I want to say is, first of all, thank you for this comprehensive, well thought out, well researched report on an issue that is so has so much potential for realizing the vision at the Los Angeles River that has been collectively put together over the last number of decades. And this is, I think, a very exciting potential, huge step forward in terms of helping us reach that potential as outlined in the Revitalization Master Plan that was adopted in 2007. So I couldn't be more pleased with the information contained within this report and the options that we have in the way of moving forward. And just a couple of really, I think, things I'd like to highlight. I'm so glad that you placed an emphasis on a revenue stream for the production of affordable housing. That is a value that I have preached to the choir about since taking office, which is also one of the components of these enhanced infrastructure financing districts passed by the state that I think is a linchpin to building broad support for this mechanism. And just to highlight something that is contained within your report, and that is, it's important to note that the Eifd revenues are not new money. Tax increment revenues captured by an Eifd are future property tax dollars that would have otherwise been collected by taxing entities to fund services. On the other hand, there's no additional cost to property owners and taxpayers. That's really important that we all communicate that every chance we get, that this is not a tax increase. It is simply a mechanism to reinvest already collected tax dollars back into the immediate environment where those tax dollars are being collected. Again, I think this process has the greatest potential for creating real change at the Los Angeles River since I have been aware of all of the advocacy of the Los Angeles River since the late 1980s in my own personal case. So I couldn't be happier to have this report before us that gives us something real tangible to work with moving forward. So I just want to thank you. And with that, I've already taken up a few minutes, precious minutes of your time. Mr. Blumenfield, do you have any questions specifically for HRNA?
Yes, and thank you, and I really appreciate the thoughtfulness of the report. One thing, not a direct question, but whenever I hear someone characterize the CRA as being eliminated by the governor and the legislature, I feel compelled to set the record straight, considering I was the author of the bill that eliminated the CRAs and the author of the bill that recreated them as a joint mechanism. The legislature did not eliminate them. We actually saved them. It was the CRAs that committed suicide, went to the courts and invalidated the bill that was there. The legislature actually tried to save the CRA. That being said, just an obligation on that.
I stand corrected.
No problem. You know, one of the things that concerns me, of course, which you highlighted, is that all the money's coming from the north and coming from areas that are not going to benefit directly benefit. I would argue they definitely do benefit, but by the money that goes to the south part of the river, and in particular, the way that it was structured here, the 980 in matching money, most of that comes from areas that are not in that zone. It's coming from the northern areas, the areas that I represent. Is that correct?
Well, there is a larger share of revenue generated north of Griffith Park than south, but there are a substantial number of capital investments along the river in the northern portion itself, just not Alternative 20.
Right, well, of which the lion's share, 980, would be the first, as the way you described it, the first money out of the till would be to do the matching money.
Right. Yeah, but there's about $1.6 billion worth of capital improvements in the northern part of the river that need to be funded, quite apart from Alternative 20.
And, okay, so it doesn't necessarily have to be that the first 980 goes to the Alternative 20. There could be more of an equitable mechanism in terms of spending that money so that we don't, I don't like to see that written in such a manner, even though I was 100% behind getting the federal money. But part of the reason for that is that I wanted the city and the state money to be able to go to other places,
sure, and
not for it to be a black hole for river funding, but for additional money to help spread out that money. So in terms of that, I'm curious. You mentioned the other cities. I just wanted, would SCAG be involved in that in terms of trying to, or not SCAG, but the COGS potentially as a mechanism?
Not specifically, because these are jurisdiction-specific shares of the property tax. So the COGS or councils of government could be a facilitator of discussion, perhaps, but they don't receive any property tax. The cities themselves do. So it's really a matter of pursuing conversations with your colleagues on the city councils of Burbank and Glendale, as well as in Vernon, as well as the Board of Supervisors, although it's relatively small areas of those three other cities that are involved. But strictly speaking, within the 1 mile radius, there are portions, and so we included them in our analysis.
And just based on your last answer, you're talking about capital projects. Can some of this money be also spent on maintenance and on actual?
No, the statute is very clear that it's for capital investments only. As I'm sure you know from city budgeting purposes, there's sometimes some gray area between capital and operating, which could be explored. But day-to-day maintenance and operations costs would not be permitted under the state enabling statute. So it's really just for capital. But capital is defined very broadly.
Because I would be interested in figuring out how operating money, we talked about the MRCA and spending money on actual policing of the river and maintaining those capital investments. And this could be a source of potentially, I would hope it could be a source of money, but it sounds like you're saying it couldn't be.
Not for that, but it's also another reason which led the CAO's office to recommend strongly that we only include about 75% of the property tax yield, knowing that there are operating and maintenance costs that would be required that can't be funded through this mechanism, as well as the high demand on the general fund for all kinds of other city services.
And even though I like the structure of this mechanism, I want to ask the big picture question about, could we not set aside the tax increment by statute and just, we get that this is money that's coming into the city anyway. So if we didn't want to go to the voters, we didn't want to create this whole EIFD, would there not be technically a way for us to write a statute where X percent of the property tax ascribed to these areas goes to this fund, and then we would have the same amount of money in a more flexible fund?
You certainly could with the city's share of the property tax revenue. I don't know that you could do that with the county's share of the revenues.
But they could do the same thing, and we could have a JPA or something like that.
That is possible, but it wouldn't provide the opportunity to bond against those revenues, if I understand your point. And we believe that the ability to bond against those revenues and to front load the cash so that you could pay for very expensive infrastructure costs would provide you more flexibility. But because you may choose not to go that route, we did provide the analysis on a pay-as-you-go basis to give you some guidance about that.
Right. In fact, I thought you were suggesting the pay-as-you-go as potentially an attractive alternative.
How attractive it is, I think, is a judgment for you and the mayor, but I think it is certainly one other way that you could go.
Yeah, or we could do some sort of a mix, right? If we wanted to have operating funds as part of this, and we were to ascribe a portion of the property tax for operations and ongoing and a portion for capital, and we were to use the EIFD mechanism for the capital and the other portion for the operations, that could be a way to infuse money into this that would provide operations as well. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, one of the things that if you decide to produce the EIFT technique, you would have to form a financing district and adopt a financing plan. The financing plan could include estimates of the cost of operations for which you would seek other funding sources to pay for those. But ideally, the financing plan would include not only the property tax increment, but other sources of revenue that you can use for this purpose as well.
I don't want to take up all the time. One quick question on, it's maybe a little narrow, but the biggest open space, which I assume a large chunk of this money is coming from, I wanted to ask about, is the UTC site, or the old Rocketdyne site. That's in the northern part next to the river. How was that calculated?
Well, Thomas, if you want to put the 13 sub-areas up there. Well, as we indicated, we divided the length of the river into these 13 sub-areas, and let's see, I think it was the, is it the Sherman Oaks area?
No, this is in the Warner Center area. Well, I guess, because what I was wondering,
anyway,
I was trying to make heads or tails of the numbers, and you mentioned that you were using population growth estimates based on SCAG.
Right.
And
employment growth
right.
primarily.
Do you happen to know, because we had this problem with the Measure M, that their numbers are pretty out of date, or they were at the time. I don't know how up to date they were, but the Warner Center area had a 2035 plan, which vastly expanded the population projections, and I was curious if that was included in that, and then the biggest chunk of that is the UTC site, or the Rocketdyne site.
Right. Well, we didn't compare the Warner Center specific plan with SCAG's projections specifically, though I assume SCAG's projections were used, as part of the environmental work in approving the plan in the first place. But we could do that comparison for you if you'd like to see it.
Do you know what year the SCAG projections were?
Well, SCAG updates its projections every 3 to 4 years as it updates the regional transportation plan, and I believe they're in the process of doing their next iteration right now. And Thomas, do you recall which SCAG generation we used? 2012? Yeah, I think they were the 2012 projections. So I don't, and I don't recall how that.
The 2012 would be prior to the Warner Center 2035 plan, which vastly changed the numbers, increased the numbers. Mm-hmm. So I'm questioning the numbers in the Warner Center area, thinking that they're probably not accurate in terms of based on numbers that don't include the Warner Center plan, which the Warner Center plan more than added tens of thousands.
It could somewhat understate from that one sub areas, but remember we're looking at the entire 32 miles across the stretch
so anyway,
of the city.
I just flagged that as not. This is a great thing, but as something maybe to get back to us on in terms of.
We used, just if I can add, we used the SCAG numbers to cap the amount that we were looking at. We didn't actually use it to come up and generate the actual tax increment. And so, the top amount might be a bit higher, but it shouldn't impact our total numbers. So there may be some differences, but it actually was used as a cap as opposed to generating the actual numbers.
I don't want to get caught up in an app. We're looking at big picture things, but maybe I can work with you to look at it offline.
Be happy
to. Just to see, because we had this problem with Measure M. It was the same issue, and we worked with Metro, and it ended up being a substantial difference. So that's why I kind of flagged that as something. But anyway, with other colleagues, and your time is very limited. So.
Mr. Silver, can you and your team stay a few more minutes?
Sure.
Okay, Mr. Rue.
Welcome, Mr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I too concur. This is, I think, the first time I heard something very concrete about the LA River, so it's very exciting, actual funding. First off, could I get a copy of that PowerPoint?
Yes, we have copies we can distribute.
Great. Electronic would be better, actually. So, and secondarily, so when you say these monies are already being collected, these are existing monies, right? You're not talking about additional revenue projections.
Well, what we're talking about is future property tax revenue that would be generated within this area around the river over time.
Right.
But they are the same property taxes that taxpayers are paying today, as Mr. O'Farrell said. So it's not anything new that homeowners or property owners are paying.
So what's the current it's currently being collected today, and what is it being, isn't it being used for, or isn't there allocation of it already?
Yes, the property tax revenue being generated around the river now is just going to the city's general fund.
City's general fund. So this would be a redirection.
Yes, so what this does is it basically, it is, in the year that you form the district, it would freeze a baseline. This is just like in the old redevelopment days. It would freeze a baseline as of that point in time, and then the incremental growth in property tax revenue over a defined time period, rather than going to the city's general fund, would be used as a source of revenue for these improvements.
So the projected growth will be, okay, so which is unaccounted for, technically. And this is assuming we have property taxes go up, property values go up.
Yes, it's a combination of development on vacant land pursuant to the current zoning code in the city, and the periodic turnover of property from current ownership to other owners, and then resetting that assessed value at market value as opposed to historic values.
Okay, and that turns out to be 1.9 billion.
Right. Yes, the 1.9 billion is a product of a series of assumptions along those lines.
Right. But most importantly, we're not going to be robbing from Peter to give to Paul. The current, wherever that baseline is, it's going to be maintained at those service levels. Okay.
Just to interject, but for every dollar that's assumed in this, is a dollar less we assume in general fund.
Right.
Over the course of the next few years.
My bigger concern was, if we're shifting the money from general fund, then obviously that money's being used to serve other city functions. But that's why I wanted to get that clarification. So we just wouldn't get the growth in the property taxes.
We would get less growth.
Yeah, well,
or less,
you'll get
25%.
You would get the growth under any circumstances. It's just a matter of how you use it. So, the issue is, do you use it for this particular purpose in the face of a very large capital need and no other obvious funding sources of this scale, or do you use it for typical general fund purposes?
But when we get our projections of what the growth is for the city and what we're going to spend it on, the growth percentage would be that much lower because we would have assigned it to something else.
So I think that's an important point, Council Member, is that, as with the arguments about redevelopment project areas, there is the but-for argument that but for the, the investment that you would be making in front-loading these infrastructure investments, you wouldn't see the appreciation over time above what you have today.
So if I may interject, it's also about the long-term future and vision of the Los Angeles River as a priority or not for the city of Los Angeles, and where we strike the balance on generating revenues for that purpose to fulfill that vision of the river, which encompasses in this region about a quarter of the population of the city of Los Angeles. So that, and we're definitely not getting into a situation where we're robbing Peter to pay Paul, because we're talking about future revenues that will already be generated. And what balance do we strike? What's the sort of magic formula that we land on to finance these improvements and this affordable housing in this particular geographic area? And that's what we will get to eventually. And I know that with that conversation, we will also simultaneously be deciding on the city policy for EIFDs. So that will happen at the same time, generally speaking, before this comes back to this body for next steps. So,
well, thank you so much for bringing this to our attention, and I think it's very interesting, and I'd love to further this conversation as we go along.
Thank you, Mr. And I'd like to welcome Mr. Price today, and before HRNA gets away, he has a few questions for you.
Just a few. Thank you for the presentation. I was really intrigued by the discussion about using the EIFD in collaboration with leveraging it with other community benefits. And you took a look, I guess, just a survey look at the promise zones in South LA and in central part of the city. But what would be the motivation? And you say that you could go up maybe a mile outside that boundary. But what's the benefit for the EIFD? I know the benefit for the promise zone area, but what's the motivation to?
Yes, in our report, Mr. Price is correct that there is a map that illustrates the location of the city's two promise zones relative to the river, and neither one of them actually coincides with the 1 mile boundary. But the 1 mile boundary was established through quite a bit of consultation with the city staff team and outside stakeholders, and also considers, per the discussion we were just having, that the wider the boundary becomes, the more property tax revenue is devoted to this purpose as opposed to other city general fund requirements. So what we were trying to do is strike a balance about what seemed to be a reasonable boundary for this district around the river to accomplish the intended purpose without causing undue harm to the rest of the city's general fund. But, Mr. Price, it may be worth knowing that, like the old redevelopment days, the state statute for EIFDs does permit expenditures of funds generated within the district for capital improvements outside of the boundaries of the EIFD if the appropriate relationship between the two can be established. So the newer, I believe it's the newer of the two promise zones, does almost touch this 1 mile boundary. It's very close, but not quite overlapping with it. So as the new financing district, sort of wrestles with the financing plan and investment strategy, that could be something that the entity could consider.
Well, I know this is going to be coming before the Economic Development Committee, I believe, and so hopefully we can start fleshing that out a little bit more. I am curious to see what the potential linkages could be and how we could leverage some resources on both sides.
And to tag on to Mr. Price's comment, you mentioned the 13 sub-areas that were basically, the rationale was geography, existing barriers, infrastructure barriers, topography barriers. Would it be possible if we were to go in the direction of identifying sub-areas and creating zones around those, that one sub-area could have a 2 mile radius beyond the river and other sub-areas would be 1? So, in other words, could we make those decisions on the micro level?
Yes, the definition of the boundaries of the EIFD are completely up to the city or the financing entity that you would set up to carry this out. Not knowing at the outset exactly where you might want to draw those boundaries, we actually collected data for our model that has a 2 mile radius on either side of the city. So in terms of estimating revenue potential, we have the technical availability to modify these boundaries around the river or to divide them up in other ways, and pretty much any way you would want to test them. Yes, it is possible that you could stretch the boundaries in one part of the river and narrow it in others. Those are issues, for further consideration.
Right, and I think it's important that as we craft policy, even as we envision policy, that we do so based on need and not some sort of blanket approach, which I think is why, again, in all of my research on the EIFDs, it could very well be a great tool to not only accomplish our goals for the Los Angeles River, but the surrounding communities based on the justification for a particular geographic boundary where we could address some of the important issues as well. We can tailor this to fit those needs, and that to me is what good policy is all about anyway. And I want to just comment on something Mr. Blumenfield alluded to, which I think is becoming more and more prevalent in all of our discussions about the Los Angeles River, and that is we definitely need to begin heading down the road for the creation of a joint powers authority. As we create more resources for the river, we're going to create greater need for the maintenance, supervision, you name it, access, public safety, and we can only do that adequately if we do have a joint powers authority. I know the purpose of this discussion is not for that, but it's come up a number of times, and I think that this body will begin exploring that concurrently as we identify resources to make very real things happen at the river. So I just wanted to say that too. Anything else for? Yes,
one more
sir.
question, and I'll got a million, but I'll try to keep them down. I was very interested. You mentioned the but-for arguments, which is I totally get with the CRA. That's the logic behind the creation and evolution of the CRA. Have you guys done analysis? And what I'm concerned about is that I don't know that the but-for arguments hold up with the EIFD. I think we may justify it based on some of the good things Mr. O'Farrell was talking about in terms of, hey, this is a way to set that priority. But I would be curious if there was analysis done on the but-for arguments. In other words, showing how the properties themselves increase in value because of the river issues. That makes a lot easier of a justification than, and I mentioned the UTC site. It's harder to imagine that on the UTC site because there's a lot of things that are making that skyrocket. But if there was some analysis of the but-for argument, I think that would help us add to the reasons for an EIFD beyond just the straight-up prioritization. Have you guys done that kind of analysis?
Well, there's sort of two dimensions to that. I think one is proximity to the river. And we did do some sensitivity analysis in which we assumed that there might be a value premium the closer you are to the river rather than further away. So we did that kind of analysis. But the other dimension to it, which is I think the one that you're really focusing on, is how much would these property values grow over time anyway, even if you weren't doing this. And we did take a preliminary look at that because it was also of some concern to the CAO's office, and we believe that the investment that you would be making in this particular way would probably far exceed what you might call the natural growth in property value over time if you were to do nothing, only because you're making a substantial investment of potentially up to $6 billion in capital improvements that would lead to property value growth over time.
But that's the geography question too.
Yes.
Because if you make all the capital investment in south of Griffith Park and you're not seeing it north, then what would be the but-for argument?
Well, our analysis takes in the dozens and dozens and dozens of projects across the entire 32-mile length of the river within the city of LA. And as I indicated, about $1.6 billion worth of those are north of Griffith Park. So that's the comparison that we made.
Great. Thank you.
Terrific. Mr. Silver, thank you and your team, and we'll have lots more great discussions moving forward. Thank you.
Our pleasure, Mr.
Great work.
Feller. Thank you, committee members.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the good report.
Mr. Hughes, a couple of questions for you now. Thanks for your patience, and thanks for all of your work on generating this report and working with HRNA at my pushiness to get this going. Really appreciate it. I think the result so far is very encouraging, so I appreciate all your work on this. A question I have for you in terms of you had mentioned this in your opening remarks in terms of the EIFD policy. Could you explain where that draft report is, how that's coming along, and when it will be ready to be submitted for the Economic Development Committee?
Sure. The establishment and investment policy, I might add, because on the one hand, to establish an EIFD is theoretically a great idea, but to really have an investment policy behind the same, I think it bodes well for the city of Los Angeles. The report, or the policy, if you will, it has been prepared. It's done. Okay. And there is a transmittal that's being prepared now, and hopefully within the coming weeks, it'll go before the ED committee, and we'll get it scheduled or calendared soon thereafter, maybe ideally the first week or two of January, if in fact the calendar allows for the same. So it's imminent. I'd like to think within the next 45, 60 days.
Terrific. Terrific. Thank you. And are there any other areas of the city that are currently being studied for EIFDs? I know there's been lots of talk, lots of dialogue. How far along are some of those other areas? And I gather from conversations you and I have had that this EIFD study for the river will help inform and perhaps form a bit of a template for other areas of the city that are being considered.
Yes. The answer to your first question, yes. There are other areas of the city whereby an EIFD, there's been some exploratory conversation with other council districts. I might add that considering the EIFD establishment and investment policy has recently been completed, what the department now has is a preliminary tool to do the preliminary assessment of any particular geographic boundaries that a particular council office might have. And so now that we have that, we can go back to the particular council office that had made an inquiry and provide them with some preliminary numbers. And so that's great. I might add, in the flow or the continuum, if you will, of establishing an EIFD, what the department, in collaboration with others, have decided that it's best to initially do the preliminary assessment, then sort of come back to the tables to see if ultimately the council and others in the mayor's office concur. And then as we proceed, we would likely engage a third party, such as HRNA and others, to really get into the weeds of everything. But thankfully, as of today, we can do the preliminary assessment that I believe some council offices might need and want.
Excellent. That answers my question exactly. And are we aware of any of our neighbors pursuing EIFDs, Burbank, Glendale, Pasadena, other cities in the county that you're aware of, south of us or north of us or east of us?
Yes, I am. I believe the city of Long Beach, for one, is contemplating an EIFD, as was alluded to earlier by Paul, particularly actually in the context of the longer LA River project, if you will. But there are other cities that I know that are sort of thinking it about, kicking it around. Certainly the county, it's on their radar, and at the appropriate time, I believe that the appropriate conversations will take place to see how we can facilitate anything that's going to happen here in the city of LA.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. All right, I mean, I think it's all been covered. Based on Mr. Silva's report, can you think of any other implementation strategies that have come to mind since this report was generated?
In general, in light of just tax increment financing, if you will, there is something else out there that's sort of akin to redevelopment, namely the CREAs. And so our office is also evaluating the establishment of CREAs in different areas. So we're really trying to exhaust every resource that might be out there to help stimulate economic development in communities throughout greater Los Angeles. Certainly with the absence of redevelopment, that was a huge blow to the city, and I believe certain cities, certain areas within the city are suffering more than others. Mm-hmm. And so to the extent that we have the possibility of capturing certain dollars, that'll be great, and notwithstanding the impact to the general fund, that's definitely understood by EWDD, and is really just a matter of portioning out and highlighting those projects and areas that could benefit sort of from a little more attention than others, similar to the LA River.
And we get inquiries about the establishment of CREAs from time to time. Can you explain just a little bit about what that is? It's a similar process, but very different at the same time.
Yeah, different indeed. Community Revitalization Investment Authority is an authority whereby tax increment revenues are captured for the benefit of some future development. Similar to redevelopment, the CREA has a requirement of affordable housing. Mm-hmm. Under redevelopment, I believe there was a 20% set aside. Under the CREA, there is a 25% set aside specifically for affordable housing. With the CREA, similar to redevelopment, there is the power of eminent domain. So there are instances whereby the public authority might find it in the interest of the general public to move forward in acquiring particular property for the benefit of the public. Mm-hmm. Moreover, with the CREA, similar to redevelopment, it also has certain area median income provisions, if you will, and other static tests that need to be met in order to determine the eligibility of the particular geographic area. So similar to the EIFD, it is a tax increment tool used to finance infrastructure, affordable housing, acquisition by a particular public enterprise or authority, if you will, and aggressively, if you will, go about redeveloping communities in need of the same.
But it's more site-specific, more focused, pinpointed geography as opposed to something with a greater breadth, generally speaking?
Yeah, it's definitely very, very mm-hmm. Directed, if you will, particularly given some of the constraints to define a CREA, particularly with respect to 80% of AMI. The crime has to be at a certain level above the state's average, I believe. And so with those different criteria, it sort of restricts where a CREA could actually be established, unlike an EIFD, which is essentially throughout all of Los Angeles.
And I think you just made the case on our approach for EIFD at the river as opposed to the CREA approach. And just to underscore again, we can bake into this a requirement, a set-aside requirement for affordable housing.
With an EIFD?
With an EIFD.
Yes, that's the beauty mm-hmm. of, at least in my mind, of having an establishment policy. It's letting the powers that be get into the weeds and what is necessary to establish the same.
Terrific. Colleagues, questions? Mr. Blumenfield?
Good.
No, you're good?
Okay.
Yeah, we're good. All right. Well, thank you so much. Very exciting. Thanks. Really appreciate all your work on this, Sam. So what I'd like to do is, we'll do, colleagues, without objection, is we'll note and file the Economic and Workforce Development Department report and request EWDD report back on the next steps and timeline that an EIFD will need in order to be created. And of course, again, this will cascade forward along with the full report on the implementation policy for the city through the Economic Development Committee.
May I sort of
Yes.
ask or comment on one thing
Okay.
as part of that report? If we talked about with HR&RA about the potential for operations, and maybe as part of the report you can look into that, because one of the things I see will be important for the river is some form of revenue to actually operate the different parks and the thing. And I know that there are restrictions on that, but I also know that there's some creativity that can be baked in. So as part of the report, if you could look into that as well.
Will do. Actually, just as a side note, with respect to the establishment policy, I've also already given some thought to that, and so what will ultimately come before the body, I think and I hope it addresses that already. If not, I'll certainly expand upon the same.
Yeah, well, please, if you've already thought about it, give us your thoughts on that right now, the teaser, I guess.
Well, it's the short of it is, it appears as though on an ongoing basis with respect to EIFDs, it can cost as much as $500,000 or so to set up and establish. And particularly, depending on the size of the same, it could run upwards of $1 million or so per year to run the authority. And as it relates to specific districts, for example, along the LA River or any other area, the cost of operations in the same could swell or, retract, if you will. But generally, there is definite upfront cost associated with setting it up. I hope this is your question. And then, of course, the ongoing maintenance of the same.
It's partially, it baked into my question is both the operations of the actual authority, as you mentioned, but also the operations of patrolling the river and those kinds of things.
That will have to be considered. That has not been considered. So I'll see what we could do to sort of tweak what we've got to address that concern.
And I think, if I may interject, I think maybe what Mr. Blumenfield is also getting at is we know that this study was based on the 75% yield of the increment. There's that other 25% possibility that could be considered or explored for the purpose of monies for a JPA or management and maintenance of the river.
Yeah, although I thought the reason they kicked out the 25% was to account for the city's assumption
Yes.
of general operating.
I think so too, but it was really clear that the EIFD funds cannot be used for management and maintenance. So we could either work within the 75% and go 65 and identify 10. I mean, maybe that's where we could take a look at that, because I agree, we absolutely must establish a permanent revenue stream to manage and maintain the river. We've got to. So maybe when you come back, we're going to note and file this report, but you'll report back on next steps and timeline. Maybe at that point you could require on some sort of arrangement that could address where we're going.
Sure. Actually, to your point, I guess it's sort of discounting the ask, if you will. And if in fact it's 65% and a 10% spread will go towards ongoing operation and maintenance, or if it's some variation of the same, that can be done. But then also revisiting just how much we can generate, right, in terms of capital to conduct.
But you would need to have a mechanism to actually capture that. Otherwise, it's getting thrown back to the general fund and assuming that we're going to weigh it against all the other priorities and come up with operations money. Whereas if it's somehow baked in, and I know it may not be able to be baked into the actual EIFD, but into the underlying statute or into the initiative or something, maybe there's a way to bake in the appropriate, because we want to have this river be great, and we want to make sure that it's not starved for maintenance every year either.
Yeah, absolutely.
Understood. Okay, we'll do.
Great.
Right. Thanks again. Thanks again, Mr. Hughes. Great work. Appreciate that very, very much. So without objection, that will be the order. Thank you. So be it. Which moves us to item 2. Before we do that, Mr. Sutton-Willis, I think that we have no more public comment cards, so we'll close public comment card at this time, and we'll go with item number 2.
Item number 2, Department of Cultural Affairs report relative to the updated annual expenditure plan and fee status report for the Arts Development Fee Program for fiscal year 2016-17.
Thank you, Felicia Filer, Director of Public Art for the Department of Cultural Affairs, and I'm joined by my colleague Tanya Picasso, the Arts Development Fee Manager. First of all, we'd like to indicate that we have submitted an amended report to Attachment A. When we were reviewing the report at the close of last week, we caught a number of typos and errors, and so we have corrected those errors and submitted the modified report for approval by Council. The Department is here to request the review and approval of the ADF Expenditure Plan report, and specifically there's $818,000 in priority fees that need to be approved by Council before the end of December. Priority fees are fees that have been collected in the trust fund that are older than 5 years, and for those fees, the Council needs to make a determination in terms of how those fees are going to be used. Our staff met with each Council office to determine what the priority uses for those fees would be and develop the expenditure plan in accordance with the Council office's desired plan. There is an attachment, a project commitment sheet that describes what the proposed use will be for those fees. Additionally, there was an overwhelming sort of trend and interest in projects that are, utility boxes, for example, a lot of music festivals, mural conservation, new murals program. And so to expedite that volume of work, the department has released requests for qualifications to establish providers to help administrate and provide services for utility boxes, for murals, and an upcoming one for festival producers. So we're here to request permission to have this report approved by Council and also to instruct the Controller to appropriate the interest associated with each appropriation account. And we'd like that to go to Council forthwith.
Terrific.
We're here to answer any questions you might have about the
Thank you, Ms. Filer. Just, colleagues, to provide some context, upon taking office back in 2013, one of the very first pieces of action I took was I approached our colleague, Jose Huizar, to explore and really achieve the goal of unlocking the arts development fee funding that had been dormant for 7 years based on a legal determination. And so the funds had been languishing, and so we brought all the departments together, anyone related to this in the development community, city departments, to collaborate in the interest of the arts. We had lost 7 years of momentum of actually creating art projects across the city. It's a huge win, and so, but what did this do? It left a lot of loose ends. Once we, as a body, adopted this, and we sorted out all of the difficulties. That was, I think, in late 2014 that we finally got this back on track. Since then, the arts development fee has been in place, and we're collecting funds across the city for all these projects, and we're able now to create art across the city in all of our districts, and it gives us the great opportunity of making decisions in collaboration with the Department of Cultural Affairs on how that will look across our districts. So what we have here is we took a vote, provided the Department of Cultural Affairs with an expenditure plan for the funds which were scheduled to expire, right? So those funds were in lockdown and not being spent at all. So what we have is, in addition to the $1.7 million, we also have new structure and guidelines that were adopted at that time to allow the city to continue spending the millions more in years to come. Eventually, we'll draw all that down of the old funds, and we'll just have a clean slate every year moving forward. So what you just heard is a brief report by Ms. Filer on the public art project commitments and associated findings. So I appreciate that. I hope that makes sense. I know that they DCI, I want to just really thank you for meeting with all of the staffs of all of us to explain this in detail and what that means. So with that, I have just really one main question, and that is, you've worked extensively to prepare the accurate reports on the priority fees and the projects assigned to each fee in each council district. If for any reason a council office wants to change the project, what will be the steps required to do that, just if that happens?
Yes, actually we'll just change the, first of all, we'll work with the council office to make sure that the reasonable relationship between the new project type and the fees is met. And then we will update the next, what we will, in our next report to council, indicate the change in use from, a music festival to a film festival or something like that. So there's actually a few examples in this report where there were some accounts that had a to be determined, or that the fee that the proposed use was has been changed from what it was previously in last year. And so we have just created a new project commitment sheet that describes what the new project type is.
Okay.
So we work with the council office administratively to change the use, and then we update the report to show the new use in future reports.
And that's updated yearly?
Annually, correct.
Yeah. Terrific, thank you. All right, colleagues, questions? Mr. Price.
Thank you for all your work. I know our office really relies upon you a lot, and we appreciate the collaborative approach to not only identifying the money but spending it and helping us to make that happen. Curious, so the 5-year rule, what happens? The money goes back to the feds, or it goes back to the general fund, or it goes back someplace? What happens if we don't expend these funds in a timely manner?
If the fees have not been, that have been collected in the trust fund have not been spent within 5 years, then those are earmarked as priority fees, and the council needs to make a finding before the end of the fiscal year.
Or what happens?
Or the fees are subject to be refunded back to the developer.
Okay. Yeah.
And so we don't want that to happen, and so we've been working consistently, as the council member Farrell said, the first year we had $1.7 million in priority fees that needed to have findings. Today we're at $818,000, so we're trending in the right direction to reduce the number, to spend down the oldest fees first.
Well, when are the RFPs going out on the utility boxes and festivals and the other techno assistance? Yeah.
When are they going out?
Are they going out? Or
Yes.
Are they out? When are they coming back? When are we going to?
They are, the RFQs have been released, and the artists and organizations have submitted their material, and so we will be setting up panels to review those submissions.
And you envision having a list of maybe 4 or 5 in each category, or just 1 or 2, or?
There'll be probably upwards of 20 or 30. The idea is to identify providers, artists, organizations from each council district, so that there's for those districts that want to use a local provider.
Right.
So our
And how is that going to expedite the process, you hope? How is that going to speed things up? Once you have a list, once you have?
Yes, then we can go directly to the list of pre-qualified organizations and ask them to submit proposals and budgets to implement a music festival or, a mural project, et cetera, as opposed to having to work with the council office to identify a particular provider and where there's, the intent is that this will be expedited because these organizations have been pre-qualified and they are known that they can do the work and perform the services.
All right. Thank you.
Colleagues? Mr. Blumenfield.
You're talking about the priority fees and the findings. What exactly is required under the State Mitigation Fee Act in terms of findings that we have to make?
We have to report on the opening balance, the interest accrued, the end balance, and identify a use, a project typology, and determine the reasonable relationship associated with that project as part of a comprehensive finding. So our Attachment A document reflects that in the project commitment sheet that really kind of specifies what the festival would be, whether it's Central Avenue Jazz Festival or the Reseda Art Walk, for example.
But the reasonable relationship, we have a fair amount of discretion on that?
It depends on the type of project. So we are no longer bound by a geographic radius. It has to do more with a reasonable relationship. So if the project, for example, has a regional draw, we are able to pool and cluster fees. But we do need to make a reasonable relationship from where the fee is generated and where it is being spent at all times.
Like we did, DCA used funding from different districts for the citywide art project around the river. Mm-hmm. How did that work, or how did the council offices interact to make that successful?
Well, the fees that we use for the public art biennial, the department identified a budget cap for each council office and identified ADF fees that were under $10,000, the threshold of $10,000. We had a lot of small, amounts paid in, and so we pooled those and clustered them at a particular site that had been pre-identified with the council office, Rec and Parks, in terms of where the project activity was going to take place. And I should say that for all of our, for the use of these fees, we require the artist or the organization to market to the address in which the fees were obtained, so that we make sure that we draw that nexus back, saying that to indicate that the developers or users of those facilities have been notified and have been marketed to participate in this activity. So I think we worked with the council office and the city departments to identify the locations, and then a marketing team to sort of spread the word to the broader community.
So that the payer of the fee can be somehow engaged in the ribbon cutting or the whatever it is or the art festival. They can be part of it.
Yes.
Yeah, makes sense. And we're talking about the funds going back to the developer. We had to return funds this last year, or are we now able to avoid that?
I think we're able to avoid it.
In its entirety.
Yes, in its entirety.
Yeah, which is why we, on an annual basis, as part of our administrative guidelines, come before the committee and council to make those findings.
Anyway, I appreciate you guys have been doing great with this, and sort of the new flexibility has been good. So thank you.
All right. All right, colleagues, no other comments or questions? So I am going to move that we approve the Department of Cultural Affairs report recommendations on the arts development fee without objection. There is no objection, so that shall be the order. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Sutton-Willis, that brings us to item number 3.
Item number 3, Chief Legislative Analyst and City Administrative Officer Joint Report relative to the acquisition of the Taylor Yard G2 parcel located 2.5 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles. If we need to, we have other language to prepare us to go to closed session.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Shall we begin the report?
Yes. Good afternoon, committee members. Matthias Farfan with the Chief Legislative Analyst Office. I'm joined here with the city staff from the CAO. We have also City Attorney and Public Works, Bureau of Engineering, and Board of Public Works in the room to answer any follow-up questions you may have. And as stated, we're here to provide an update on the acquisition of Taylor Yard G2. On October 26th, the council and the mayor authorized staff to open escrow with Union Pacific for the potential acquisition of Taylor Yard G2. The opening of escrow required a deposit of $100,000, which was borrowed from the reserve fund, and we opened escrow on October 31st, 2016. The opening of escrow has triggered a 120-day escrow period, of which the first 90 days are a feasibility review period, which would allow the city to research certain items needed to either recommend or not recommend the acquisition of Taylor Yard G2. As a result of that, Arts and Parks Committee and also Budget and Finance Committee instructed staff to report back on additional items aside from those that city staff had planned on reporting back on as part of the feasibility review period. Some of the report backs were requested to occur within 45 days. Other report backs were requested to occur back when we come back in January as part of the feasibility review period conclusion. The items recommended by Arts, Parks, and River Committee were 4 items, and there was 3 additional item report backs requested by Budget and Finance Committee. I'll just quickly go through those right now, and then after that, if you have any questions, as I mentioned before, city staff are here to answer those questions. The first item requested by Arts, Parks, and River Committee was in regards to reimbursement resolution for the reserve fund for the $100,000 that was borrowed to open escrow. This is the only item on today's agenda and report that we're recommending approval of because it needs to occur within 60 days of having expended the funds. This reimbursement resolution would only come into play if the city ultimately decides to close escrow. Then this would allow the reserve fund to get reimbursed from MICLA. Item number 2 and 4 are in regards to the EIR and EIS addendum to the Arbor study. Bureau of Engineering is here to respond to any questions you may have regarding that. They are working on that report still. Item number 3 from the Arts and Parks River Committee request was in regards to the state grant funding, the status of negotiations with the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy. This item is in regards to $25 million that's been set aside as potential funds that could be used to offset city costs in regards to Taylor G2. Our update on this item, the mayor's proposed budget initially included $60 million from MICLA to be used on Taylor G2, but since $20 million of these state funds are allocated for acquisition costs related to Taylor G2, the amount reserved in MICLA was reduced to $40 million in the adopted budget. At this point, it's unlikely that any agreement with the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy would take place during the escrow period. That would likely happen after the city acquires a property. So we'll still report back on that in January, but it's likely that we will need an additional $20 million from another funding source. At this point, the only other funding source we've identified is MICLA.
But again, Matthias,
yes,
that we would obtain site control before any negotiation.
Yes, exactly.
For that other percent of the parcel.
That is correct.
Okay,
that is correct. Regarding Budget and Finance Committee requested updates, items 5 and 6 are report backs for the Bureau of Engineering and also the River Group, the River Team, and these will be part of the January report back to Council. And item number 7 was a request from Budget and Finance regarding actions that could be taken by the city to exit escrow and recover a deposit prior to the end of the feasibility review period. On that particular item report back, the actual PSA that was executed for the opening of escrow has language in there which would require the city to affirmatively state to the escrow company that we intend to close escrow within the 90 days. If the city takes no action within the 90 days, that would be an automatic decision by the city to forgo the purchase of Taylor RG2 at this time, and we would receive our deposit at that point. Aside from the report backs from Arts, Parks, and River Committee and Budget and Finance Committee, as I mentioned before, we are working on other items in regards to the feasibility review period. The first is regarding the financing for the acquisition of Taylor RG2. The second one is communicating with current easement holders on Taylor RG2 in regards to the use of their surface area, just to make sure that there's a clear understanding between us and them as how we intend to use the surface area to make sure there won't be any conflicts. And the third item is to make sure there's no significant risk to health, safety, or the environment that's posed by an oil pipeline that's running parallel to the rail that's on Taylor RG2. That brings me to the conclusion of my presentation. If there's any questions by committee members, we'd be happy to answer those at this time.
Thank you. Anything to add from?
Hi, Jacqueline Larkin with the CAO's office, and no, nothing more to add.
All right. Thank you so much. Well, so colleagues, this is a report that we asked for when we, as the City Council, decided to move forward with going into escrow. But two of the required steps are coming back before this committee and going back before the Budget and Finance Committee. So we are doing our administrative job here in helping to move this forward so we can go into escrow, which does not mean we are deciding and supporting the purchase of G2. The first step is to go into escrow. Then other findings will happen, same as when you go into escrow on a home purchase. And if things are discovered during that period that make moving forward with the purchase very unattractive for the city, we as a body can then just fall out of escrow and say la vie. However, having said that, this is a very, very important parcel, and one of the keystones, I would say, of once-in-a-generation opportunity at the LA River. If we don't at least explore the purchase of G2, then you better believe it will be picked up by private interests, and we'll have no control whatsoever of the future of this important parcel right next to the Los Angeles River. So having said that, a few questions for you, and that is, when does the state anticipate finalizing the appraisal, and are there any deadlines? Could you talk about the deadlines that we must meet?
The deadline that the city must meet within the 90-day feasibility review period is the end of January. That would place us, I believe, January 26th would be the last regularly council meeting that this could be taken up by for action. Regarding the state grant funds, they are governed by the Wildlife Conservation Board. It would be coming through them to the Santa Monica Conservancy, and then we would enter in an agreement with them. That board only meets quarterly, so that takes some time. And as I mentioned previously when we reported the first time, the $20 million that has been set aside for acquisition does require the state to perform its own appraisal of Taylor RG2, which we're anticipating will be completed sometime in January. That appraisal will then determine how much the total size area that the $20 million, that the ask that will be coming from Santa Monica Mountain Conservancy, that is open to negotiations whether or not the city does agree with that appraisal and other factors. Also, that easement agreement would also include, and it would be to acquire an easement on Taylor RG2. That easement agreement would include other terms as far as what the restrictions Santa Monica Mountain Conservancies would want to place on usage of that easement area, or if they have their own plans for it. And depending on what those terms are, that may require a separate, CEQA may require a separate process for that to actually go through before we can execute that agreement. But that would all be coming back in January. So that's when we foresee coming back to council and giving a more up-to-date status on those negotiations.
So tell me what happens if the Budget and Finance Committee does not act. What happens then?
If they don't act, first of all, on the reimbursement resolution, on the item that's recommended here, then if the city does decide to purchase Taylor RG2 and we decide to use tax-exempt MECLA bonds to acquire the property, then we would not be able to reimburse the general fund the $100,000 with those proceeds. But on a go-forward basis, when we report back in January, if council does not take action to affirmatively state that the city is interested in closing escrow by the end of January, then that will be taken as the city is not interested in closing escrow, at which point the escrow company will return this to the city, its $100,000 deposit, and then now Union Pacific is free to sell the property to another buyer.
And we're out. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So I think you kind of mentioned this. The addendum, once finalized, if it's sufficient for environmental review process needed for a project, any project on G2, as it relates to the LA River, or will additional environmental review or documentation be needed?
Yeah, and that depends on what that final agreement states. That will determine whether or not we do need to follow a new CEQA process, either an addendum to the existing EIR, if the uses are consistent with the EIR that was approved by council. If they differ from that, then we'll have to then report back on the recommended CEQA process to follow at that point.
But that won't even be a step unless we get site control.
That is true.
Correct. Okay. And then that also sort of falls into any additional environmental review required for any interim uses. what can we say about that? We talked about that last time in terms of doing something that might require just a mitigated negative deck as opposed to a full environmental impact review based on the magnitude of the project. Whether there's a short-term project that might just include creating trails or a longer-term project that is much more ambitious.
That is correct. And as I mentioned in the previous report, the stated purpose of acquiring Taylor RG2 at this point is for the Alley River Ecosystem Restoration Project. But that project requires several steps subsequent to the acquisition of Taylor RG2. There's a forthcoming design agreement that needs to be executed between the city and the Army Corps. And then once the design is completed, then an actual project agreement needs to be executed with the Army Corps in order to, at that point, dedicate Taylor RG2 towards that Alley River Ecosystem Restoration Project. And that process may take, anywhere from a year to 2 years. It might take 5 years. We don't know at this point. So staff was asked to report back on potential interim uses until that happens. Mm-hmm. We have met with the state DTSC. They are open to discussions on interim uses on Taylor RG2. So that work is in process. Bureau of Engineering is the lead on that. Again, we'll come back in January with the report back on that. But again, it all depends on what those interim uses are. Will dictate what CEQA process is required at that time.
Okay. And Ms. Wagner, in terms of if we utilize MECLA funding for the acquisition of this, what might be the debt service requirements?
Okay, so I have Natalie Brill for our debt manager.
Okay.
Natalie Brill, CAL's office. Because the property itself has not been mitigated yet, we will be using commercial paper until the until the property is mitigated. Nobody will accept the property as a leased asset if it's not rehabilitated. So we'll have to put it into commercial paper until it can be, and then we'll put it into long-term debt later. So the debt service will fluctuate depending on
what we do.
Yeah, and also, as far as the reimbursement resolution, if we decide to use taxable debt, then we can reimburse at any time. It's only if there's costs associated that are tax exempt where we need the reimbursement resolution. We're putting it in place just to cover ourselves in case you all decide you want to spend additional money on rehab or studies or something. You won't have to go back and scramble to do it. We'll might as well just do it now as we're reporting back to you. Mm-hmm. It's just a precaution for now.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, colleagues, questions, concerns? Mr. Rue.
Thank you. So this is just the first of more reports we're going to get back, right?
Excuse me?
This is just the first, I guess your first installment of the reports?
Correct. We'll be coming back in January.
So the 90-day period ends on January 29th.
Yes, sir.
To get the refund back. To get the $100,000 deposit back.
Yes.
Yes.
So do you know approximately when we're going to receive these reports, especially the EIR and the number 2, number 4, number 5, and 6? I know it says January, but we're not going to get it like 2 days before the 29th, right?
No. We should be getting those out. And I would like it to be early January, at latest second week in January, just to make sure we get through the committee process, review process, and then full council.
Yeah, because obviously we need those portions of the report are the more salient ones where we need those information to make the decision moving forward. This question might be more for the chair. I'm not sure. So since January 29th is the first deadline, especially for the refund, if for some reason we wanted to pull escrow or stop escrow, how do we go about that? I don't know. Council can exit escrow at any point during the 90 days. Mm-hmm. But the way it's worded in the PSA, if no action is taken within 90 days to affirm that the city is interested in closing escrow, then the escrow you mean ending escrow?
Yeah, ending escrow. The escrow company will take it as though the city is not interested in purchasing G2, and they'll return a deposit. So if no action is taken, that means that the city is not interested in closing escrow, and that would be the exit of escrow. If
no action on our part, we'll just kill the escrow.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Yes.
And the last day that we can act is the 26th of January, because it's the last time we meet before the actual calendar deadline.
I believe so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if we want to move forward, then we just require action in committee. That's good enough. Or do we just have to be a council?
So what needs to happen, what we're doing is,
27.
we are, probably going to, if you all support, approve the reimbursement resolution. That's all that's before us today. Then our Budget and Finance Committee must do the same before council acts. Is that correct?
This is correct.
Yeah. So that's what we're doing. Once this committee approves the reimbursement resolution, then this committee work is done. We'll get another bite at the apple when it comes to council. Or Bob will have another bite at the apple because he's on the Budget and Finance Committee. That's kind of where we are.
Could I get clarification on that? So we'll get once we approve this, those reports like the EIR and the other projections won't come back here. It'll just go to council.
They will come back. Well, we'll release our report. They'll likely get referred to Arts, Parks, and River Committee, as well as Budget and Finance Committee. And at that point, then it depends on what occurs in what actions occur in those two committees, is whether or not we'll proceed with notifying the escrow company whether or not we're interested in closing escrow. And I'd just like to clarify that we have until January 29th to notify the escrow company that the city is interested in closing escrow. I believe it's actually January 27th is the last.
27th.
Yeah,
Is the last day.
That's
the Friday.
It's the Friday. And so, because it falls on a weekend, we'll have to get some clarification on city attorney as far as how we treat the weekend, whether we have until Monday to notify the escrow company or whether we needed to before.
But it would require council action on the last possible meeting date would be the 27th.
It'll either be the 25th or the 27th.
Right.
In order to meet the 30-day.
And the council would have to
90-day.
Council would have to affirmatively vote to go through with this. Otherwise, it gets.
Yes, because upon notifying the escrow company that the city is interested in closing escrow, they will release the city's $100,000 deposit to Union Pacific. And at that point, if the city then decides to exit escrow after the 90-day period, we'd lose the $100,000 deposit.
Right. So all I could urge is the other portions of the report, if you could get it back to us as soon as possible. And I have no further questions because those are the reports I'm looking for. And
okay.
But we will hear them here in committee, right, Mr. Chair?
It looks like we will.
Yes, there are 3 additional report backs that we will be bringing back to this committee.
And when will that be? Within 30 days?
It'll be.
That's that.
In January.
Yeah.
In advance of the 27th.
Yeah, it'll be early to mid-January.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because first week of January is recess, right? So it would be second week of January.
We'll schedule it right away. All right. Thank you.
All right.
Mr. Blumenfield.
No, thanks. Great. Like my colleagues, we want to get these reports. It's going to be tricky because we're out for the first week in January, and this is up in the 4th week in January. So the earlier, the better. And toward that end, the Department of Toxic Substances Control, they have a report that's sort of is a precursor to the EIR. Is that right?
Yes. There's already been a remedial action plan that was approved by the state to clean up Taylor RG2 to industrial standards. And that required its own CEQA process, but that was to remediate it to industrial standards.
So are we waiting on anything from Department of Toxic Substances?
At this point, it's just a discussion with them as far as that the city is interested in acquiring Taylor RG2, and if we do interim uses on the property, what level of remediation would be required to perform those interim uses. So there have some, because if the city does acquire Taylor RG2, we would need to enter into an agreement with DTSC. We would take on the remedial action plan that's been approved by the state to clean it, and at that point, if we wanted to amend that cleanup plan to be something that differs from industrial use, or the timelines regarding that cleanup, all that needs to be negotiated with DTSC.
Right, because for January, obviously, the more that's outlined, I don't want us to be in the awkward position of maybe we have an EIR, but we don't have the menu of what the cleanup is going to require from DTSC, right?
Yes, we do have the requirements for the cleanup to industrial standard.
Right, but for the interim standards or sort of the backup positions with the property.
Yes, and regrettably, most of that would likely be possible after acquisition of the property, but here, Deborah's here.
Hi, Deborah Weintraub from the Bureau of Engineering. We've had initial conversations with DTSC about their openness to negotiating some interim use cleanups, and they have indicated to us that they are open to doing that, but that regrettably won't happen until after we've purchased the property. But we've shown them the kind of uses. I mean, in preparation for the report backs in January, we're doing a lot of work to get diagrams of potential uses in areas that are more or less contaminated and how we might approach it with DTSC on an incremental basis.
Okay, because I imagine that will be helpful for the discussion when we're deciding about acquisition to know what those interim steps could be.
Right. We'll do our best to get commitments from DTSC, but till we actually own the property, we can't really negotiate that with them. But we're doing our best to get.
But we'll have a strong sense of it, well, even if we have to meet in closed session, I guess, or maybe it doesn't matter at that point, but to be able to go through those in January.
Yeah, we'll do our best. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And then you're talking about the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy and CEQA, the terms. If their requirements are more restrictive than ours, do we need CEQA, additional CEQA? I mean, I'm assuming their requirements are going to be things like, passive use, perpetuity, those kinds of things.
Yes, if their uses are consistent with the Arbor study, then no additional CEQA would be required. It may just be an addendum, just to state that we're entering into an agreement with them, but their uses are consistent with the Arbor study. But if they do request usage that differs from that, then that may require additional.
Like I'm having trouble imagining.
It mainly, if they want to, in the interim, let's say, allow recreational use for the easement area, then those uses are, Deborah can probably add to that. But.
What they've talked to us about so far, it looks like it's consistent. But the overall site, if the city were to purchase it and we want to propose some interim uses while we develop an agreement with the Army Corps, we may need an additional addendum for all of the uses of the site. And it could be something like large public gatherings, use the site, or on an interim basis to use it for construction laydown area. I'm not talking about Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy right now. I'm talking about the city.
Right. As far as the conservancy piece, because you were worried about that, you're saying recreational use is not consistent?
Well, some recreational use.
I think their recreational uses will be largely consistent from what they have told us. So.
Walking, horses, hiking, those kinds of things are consistent.
Boat launch. They want to be able to do a boat launch, that kind of use. Yeah.
Okay. And do we have a formal MOU with them at this point, or no?
We don't. That's what we're currently negotiating with them. That's all dependent on the appraisal once it's finalized by the state. That will dictate the size of the easement. They are asking for a perpetual easement since the $20 million have been set aside for acquisition. So all that language needs to be worked out as far as how that would work. And again, yes, Deborah's correct that their uses do seem consistent with Arbor, but it all depends on what that final agreement looks like, and depending on in our discussions with city attorney whether or not they recommend different action.
Great, thank you.
And colleagues, even though it's only December 5th today, and January 26th might seem, or 27th might seem a little ways off, the calendar is very tricky in terms of availability for dates and everything. So I think we're going to rely on our good colleague Bob Blumenfield to strongly suggest that we have a joint Budget and Finance and Arts, Parks and River hearing on January 12th, because there are a lot of holidays in January. Yeah. And we may need to figure this out with very limited available dates, actually. So that would be my strong recommendation, so that gives us an additional few weeks before it coming to council, potentially, again, before we give the final approvals, so we can kind of dial down on some of these questions. And I know your colleagues on the Budget Finance Committee are going to have some questions about this as well, and I haven't had the chance to ask those questions yet.
Okay. Oh, and you could always give the report if you finish it earlier over the break. Had some time to read.
All right, so colleagues, what we'll do is I recommend that we approve the CLA and CAO recommendation to adopt the reimbursement resolution as identified in attachment 1 of the report. Without objection, that shall be the order. Thank you so much for all your work on this.
All right, thank you.
And seeing as there are no other public comment cards and no additional agenda items, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.